85-year-old Granny gets harassed by 4 bikers. They turn pale when she takes revenge. The cobblestone streets of Pinewood Town echoed with the sound of an old woman's footsteps as she made her way back home. Granny Lucia, an 85-year-old widow, was a familiar sight in the quiet, picturesque community. Everyone in the town knew her as the sweet old lady who always had fresh cookies ready for the kids, a kind smile for passers-by, and an uncanny knack for remembering every birthday in town. Yet, no one knew the truth about her past. Her small, ivy-covered cottage sat at the edge of town, surrounded by a garden that was more vibrant than any other in the area. Roses, marigolds, and daisies flourished under her care, and the sweet scent of blooming flowers often wafted through the neighborhood. Inside, her home was cozy, with antique furniture, a fireplace that was always lit during cold evenings, and shelves lined with old books. It was the epitome of warmth and simplicity. That evening, Granny Lucia was returning from the weekly farmer's market. Her woven basket, filled with fresh produce and bread, dangled lightly from her arm. The sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and the town's residents were retreating to their homes for dinner. As she turned onto a quieter street, the hum of distant motorcycles broke the serene silence. Lucia paused, tilting her head toward the sound. She wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the growing roar of engines and the faint shouts carried by the wind didn't sit right with her. She continued walking, her pace steady but her senses now heightened. The motorcycle screeched to a stop just ahead of her, blocking the narrow street. 4 men, clad in leather jackets and boots, dismounted. They laughed boisterously, their voices rough and unruly. Lucia's sharp eyes took them in quickly, young, brash, and far too confident for their own good. Well, one of them sneered, his face breaking into a mocking grin as he spotted Lucia. What do we have here? Little old Granny out past her bedtime? The others chuckled, circling her like vultures around a carcass. One of them, tall and wiry, reached out and flicked at the scarf around her neck. Nice scarf, Granny. Looks expensive. Family heirloom? Lucia's expression remained calm, though her eyes narrowed slightly. She placed her basket gently on the ground, her movements deliberate. It's just a scarf, dear, she said, her voice steady. Why don't you boys run along now? This isn't a game you want to play. Her tone carried a weight that made the leader falter for a moment, but his bravado quickly returned. Oh, we're just having fun, Granny. Don't get all riled up. Another biker, stocky with a scruffy beard, stepped forward and tipped over her basket with the toe of his boot. The fresh vegetables spilled onto the street. Oops, he said, feigning innocence. Clumsy me. The others laughed again, but their mirth was cut short when Lucia took a step closer. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and completely unafraid. The look in her eyes, however, was anything but kind. It was cold and piercing, a gaze that seemed to look straight through them. Pick it up, she said quietly. The wiry one smirked, crossing his arms. Or what? What's a little old lady gonna do, huh? Lucia tilted her head, her expression unreadable. She glanced down at the spilled groceries, then back at the men. This is your last chance to walk away, she said, her voice soft but laced with an unsettling certainty. The leader stepped closer, his cocky grin never wavering. Oh yeah? And if we don't? Lucia held his gaze for a long moment, then smiled faintly. You'll regret it. The tension in the air was palpable, but before anything could escalate further, the sound of a car's engine drew their attention. A black sedan turned onto the street, its headlights illuminating the scene. The bikers hesitated, clearly unsure if this newcomer was a threat. Lucia took the opportunity to step back and gather her fallen groceries, her movements unhurried. We'll see you around, Granny, the leader said, though his tone lacked the confidence it had moments earlier. The bikers mounted their motorcycles and roared away into the night, leaving Lucia standing alone on the street. As the sedan rolled past her, Lucia caught a glimpse of the driver, a young man with a sharp jawline and a watchful gaze. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she gave him a small nod. He returned it before driving off, disappearing into the dusk. Lucia reached her cottage and set her basket down on the kitchen table. Her hands were steady as she began putting away the groceries, but her mind was elsewhere. The encounter had stirred something deep within her, not fear, but a long-dormant instinct. She went to her living room and opened a small wooden chest that had been locked for decades. Inside were remnants of a life she had left behind, faded photographs, old passports, a silver pistol wrapped in cloth, and a black ledger filled with names and numbers. She ran her fingers over the objects, her expression unreadable. The memories came flooding back. Decades ago, she had been known as La Madre Nera, the Black Mother. She had been the matriarch of a powerful mafia family, feared and respected by allies and enemies alike. After her husband's death, she had taken control of the family business and led it with an iron will until her son, Antonio, convinced her to retire and let him take over. Under Antonio's leadership, the family transitioned to legitimate enterprises, and Lucia faded into obscurity, adopting the guise of an ordinary grandmother in a sleepy town. But tonight had reminded her that some threats couldn't be ignored. The bikers were a nuisance, yes, but nuisances had a way of growing into problems if left unchecked. Lucia's lips pressed into a thin line as she closed the chest and locked it again. She would handle this, but not in haste. She had learned long ago that patience was a powerful weapon. The next morning, Pinewood Town was abuzz with talk of the bikers. They had been spotted at the local bar, causing trouble and picking fights with anyone who dared to challenge them. Lucia's neighbors whispered about the incident in hushed tones, their voices tinged with fear. "I heard they smashed a window at the bakery," one woman said. "They're getting bolder," another muttered. "Someone needs to do something." Lucia listened quietly, her hands busy kneading dough for her famous cinnamon rolls. She didn't contribute to the conversation, but a faint smile played at the corners of her lips. Someone would do something, all right. Just not in the way anyone expected. She spent the day as she always did, tending to her garden and chatting with neighbors. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she made a phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar, gruff but warm. "Nana," it said. "It's been a long time." Lucia's smile widened. "Hello, Giovanni. I think it's time we caught up." The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but this was only the beginning. Lucia had always been a master strategist, and she wasn't about to let a few reckless bikers disrupt her peace. She would teach them a lesson they would never forget, one step at a time. The next morning, Granny Lucia awoke to the sound of chirping birds outside her window. The sunlight filtered through her lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on her walls. It was an ordinary morning, yet she felt the undercurrent of change in the air. The phone call to Giovanni the previous night was the first step she had taken toward reactivating a dormant part of her life. She hadn't made that decision lightly, but the bikers had forced her hand. As she went about her morning routine, her mind raced with possibilities. Her instincts told her the bikers wouldn't simply disappear after their antics in town. They were the kind of men who thrived on chaos, and Pinewood was too small and peaceful to contain them. She needed more information before she could act decisively. After breakfast, she grabbed her sun hat and stepped into her garden. She worked for a while, trimming roses and pulling weeds, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Finally, she wiped her hands on her apron and walked back inside. Sitting down at her oak desk, she pulled out the black ledger from the locked chest. The pages were filled with names, numbers, and coded notes that only she could decipher. It was a relic from her past life, and it still held power. Lucia flipped to a page near the back. The name she was looking for was there, Daniel Vargas. He had once been an informant for her family, a man who thrived on gossip and secrets. If anyone in Pinewood had the details she needed about the bikers, it would be him. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in over a decade. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Hello? Daniel," Lucia said, her voice calm and steady. "It's been a long time." There was a pause on the other end before the voice softened. "La Madre Nera? Is that really you?" "It is," she replied. "I need a favor." Daniel hesitated but didn't decline. Anything for you, Lucia. What do you need? Information, she said. For men, bikers. They've been causing trouble in town. I need to know who they are and what they want. Consider it done, Daniel said. I'll call you back in an hour. Lucia thanked him and hung up. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as she considered her next move. The game had begun, and she was ready to play. True to his word, Daniel called back an hour later. They're not locals, he began. Names are Jimmy Cross, Ronnie Fong Delgado, Martin Cale, and their leader, Sean Willis. Small-time criminals, mostly theft and extortion, but they've got connections to a bigger gang in the city. They're here because Pinewood is easy pickings. Lucia's jaw tightened. Connections? She asked. Yeah, Daniel confirmed. They're tied to a group called the Iron Wolves. Dangerous bunch, but these four are just bottom feeders. They're probably looking to prove themselves. Lucia absorbed the information. Thank you, Daniel. You've been a great help. Anytime, he said. And Lucia? Be careful. These men don't play fair. Lucia's lips curved into a faint smile. Neither do I. After hanging up, she began to devise her plan. If the bikers were testing their limits, she'd make sure they knew exactly who they were dealing with. But she wouldn't strike directly, not yet. First, she'd unsettle them, make them question their control over the town. Fear, after all, was a powerful tool. That evening, the bikers congregated at the Pinewood Tavern. They occupied the corner booth, their loud voices dominating the small establishment. Locals avoided looking their way, their unease palpable. Sean, the leader, leaned back in his seat, his boots propped up on the table. This place is a joke, he scoffed. No cops, no resistance. We could run this town if we wanted. So why don't we? Fong asked, his grin revealing crooked teeth. Sean shrugged. Patience. We'll start small. Shake down a few businesses, make some money. Then we expand. As they spoke, the door to the tavern creaked open. A young man walked in, his face unfamiliar to the regulars. He wore a simple jacket and jeans, blending in easily with the crowd. But there was something about his sharp gaze that hinted at a deeper purpose. He approached the bar, ordered a drink, and sat on a stool where he could observe the bikers without drawing attention. He sipped his drink slowly, his eyes scanning the room. When the bartender leaned in, the man slipped him a folded note. The bartender glanced at the note, his eyes widening slightly. He nodded and discreetly tucked it into his pocket. The young man finished his drink, left a generous tip, and exited as quietly as he had entered. Minutes later, the bartender approached the bikers. Hey, fellas, he said, his voice casual but with an edge of nervousness. Just thought you should know, someone's been asking questions about you guys. Stranger came in, didn't stay long, but he seemed real interested in your group. Sean's eyes narrowed. What kind of questions? Didn't say much, the bartender replied, shrugging. Just asked if you were new in town and if you'd be sticking around. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Sean's bravado faltered slightly, though he quickly masked it. Probably just some nosy local. We're not going anywhere. Of course not, the bartender said, retreating to the other end of the bar. Sean's confidence returned, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He leaned forward, his voice low. We're keeping an eye out. Nobody scares us off. Meanwhile, the young man returned to a sleek black car parked a few streets away. Giovanni was waiting in the driver's seat, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of the dashboard lights. Did they take the bait? Giovanni asked. The young man nodded. Hook, line, and sinker. They'll be looking over their shoulders all night. Giovanni smirked. Good. Nana will be pleased. Lucia's plan was unfolding perfectly. She wasn't just going to confront the bikers, she was going to dismantle their confidence, one calculated move at a time. By the time she was done, they wouldn't know which way was up. As Giovanni drove away, the young man glanced back at the tavern. The bikers were still inside, their laughter now tinged with nervousness. He couldn't help but admire Lucia's strategy. This was more than a game to her, it was an art form, and she was a master. The morning sun cast long shadows over Pinewood Town, but the air was heavy with unease. The four bikers, Sean, Ronnie, Fong, Delgado, Martin Cale, and Jimmy Cross, had spent a restless night in their warehouse hideout. The whispers in the tavern, the anonymous note, and the unsettling feeling of being watched were starting to gnaw at them. Inside the warehouse, a palpable tension hung in the air. The once cocky gang now looked haggard, their bravado chipped away by paranoia. Sean paced back and forth, his boots echoing off the cracked concrete floor. He was trying to keep a handle on the situation, but his frayed nerves were evident. "This isn't random," Sean muttered, breaking the silence. "Somebody's targeting us." Fong leaned against a rusted pillar, rolling a toothpick between his teeth. "You think it's the cops? Locals? What's the play here?" Sean stopped pacing and glared at him. "It's not the cops. If it were, we'd be in cuffs by now. This is someone who knows what they're doing. They want us scared." Jimmy, seated on a stack of crates, rubbed his temples. "Well, it's working. First, the stranger at the bar. Then the bikes getting messed with. Now that damn note? Someone's in our heads." Martin, usually the quiet one, finally spoke up. "We need to figure out who it is and deal with them. Fast." Sean nodded, but his confidence was clearly shaken. "We're not leaving town until we know who's behind this." As the bikers debated their next steps, they failed to notice the small, deliberate changes in their surroundings. In the shadows of the warehouse, someone had been observing them for days. Lucia's plan was methodical. Surveillance had been Giovanni's specialty, and now his younger protege, Marco, was putting those skills to use. Marco was adept at remaining unseen, planting doubts with the smallest actions. A wrench left out of place. A faint scent of cigar smoke near the motorcycles. A stack of boxes shifted slightly from its original position. These subtle signs were enough to sow suspicion among the bikers. Every time they noticed something off, their arguments grew more heated. Sean slammed his fist on a workbench, scattering tools. "This is ridiculous. Are we being haunted or something?" Fong smirked nervously. "Ghosts don't slash tires or leave notes, boss." The warehouse door creaked open suddenly, and the bikers all froze. A gust of wind swept in, but no one entered. They stared at the door, the silence amplifying their unease. Finally, Sean stood and walked over, his hand resting on the knife clipped to his belt. He stepped outside, scanning the area, but there was no one in sight. Just the sound of rustling leaves and the distant hum of pinewood. By evening, Sean decided to take action. If someone was messing with them, they needed to assert their dominance. The gang mounted their remaining operational motorcycles and roared into town. Their plan was simple: intimidate the locals, shake down a few businesses, and send a message that they weren't to be trifled with. They started at the Pinewood Tavern, barging in and demanding drinks on the house. The bartender's hands trembled as he served them, but his eyes darted toward the young man seated quietly at the end of the bar. Marco was there, blending in as usual, his face hidden under a baseball cap. He watched as Sean barked orders and Fong knocked over a chair for emphasis. From the tavern, they moved to the bakery, smashing a window and demanding money from the owner. Marco trailed them discreetly, documenting their every move. He sent updates to Giovanni, who in turn relayed them to Lucia. Back at her cottage, Lucia sat by the fireplace, knitting calmly as Giovanni spoke. "They're unraveling, Nana. The fear is getting to them." Lucia's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. Keep the pressure on. They need to know they're not in control anymore." Later that night, the bikers returned to their warehouse, only to find chaos waiting for them. Sean's motorcycle, the prize leader's ride, had been dismantled. The pieces were neatly arranged on the ground, as if by some mocking mechanic. A note sat on the handlebars. "You can't ride away from this, Sean." Sean's face turned red with fury. He kicked the pile of parts, scattering them across the floor. "This is war!" he bellowed. The others exchanged nervous glances. Martin spoke hesitantly. "Whoever's doing this, they know too much. It's like they're inside our heads." "We'll find them," Sean growled. "And when we do, they'll wish they never messed with us." But even as he spoke, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Deep down, he was beginning to realize that this wasn't just an ordinary prank. This was calculated, deliberate, and far beyond anything they had faced before. By the end of the week, the bikers' unity had started to fracture. The continuous sabotage and psychological warfare were taking their toll. Every time they tried to regroup, another setback would push them further apart. Vaughn began to voice his doubts openly. "What if it's someone connected to the Iron Wolves? Maybe they're testing us, seeing if we're strong enough to handle this town." Sean dismissed the idea. "The Wolves don't waste time with games. This is someone local. Someone who wants us gone." Jimmy wasn't convinced. "What if they're right, Sean? What if we've bitten off more than we can chew here?" Sean snapped, grabbing Jimmy by the collar. "We're not running! We're not scared of some coward hiding in the shadows." But his words lacked conviction. Even Sean couldn't ignore the feeling that their unseen opponent was always one step ahead. That night, another message arrived at the warehouse, this time written on the wall in red paint. "You've overstayed your welcome. Leave Pinewood, or face the consequences." Sean's hands trembled as he read it. Whoever was behind this wasn't just toying with them anymore, they were issuing an ultimatum. The gang leader felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He knew they were being hunted, but by whom? And why? As Sean stood there, lost in thought, a faint sound reached his ears, the distant hum of an engine. He rushed outside, but the street was empty. Only the fading echo of the sound remained, like a phantom mocking him. Meanwhile, at her cottage, Lucia reviewed the latest updates from Giovanni and Marco. Her plan was progressing perfectly. The bikers were on edge, divided, and desperate. Soon, they would be vulnerable enough for the final phase. Giovanni sat across from her, a map of Pinewood spread out on the table. "They're hanging on by a thread, Nana. Another push, and they'll break." Lucia nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "Let them squirm a little longer. Fear makes people reckless. When the time comes, we'll remind them why they should have listened." She glanced at the silver pistol lying on the table, a relic of her past. Her fingers brushed over it lightly before returning to her knitting. "They'll know soon enough. Pinewood isn't theirs to claim." The trap was tightening, and the bikers were running out of options. For Lucia, this was more than just a battle, it was a lesson. No one disturbed her peace and got away with it. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the outskirts of Pinewood. Giovanni and Marco worked methodically under the cover of darkness, putting the final elements of Granny Lucia's plan into motion. Their target was the bikers' warehouse, but this time, they weren't focused on leaving cryptic notes or physical damage. Instead, they planted something far more devastating, a hidden camera and a microphone, carefully positioned to record every word and action inside the gang's stronghold. Marco climbed down from a stack of crates, dusting off his hands after securing the camera in a discreet corner of the warehouse. "We're live," he whispered into his comm, the signal clear in Giovanni's earpiece. Giovanni gave the area one last sweep, ensuring no evidence of their presence remained. He nodded at Marco, signaling their exit, and they disappeared into the night like shadows. The next morning, Lucia sat at her dining table, sipping tea as she watched the live feed from the camera Marco had installed. The scene inside the warehouse was chaos. Sean stood at the center, his face tight with frustration as he barked orders at his crew. Martin sat on a crate, his hands running nervously through his hair, while Jimmy paced the floor like a caged animal. Vaughn leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression cold but clearly tense. Lucia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed the gang's unraveling. Sean slammed his fist on a table, shouting something incoherent, his voice trembling with anger and fear. The bikers were losing their grip on control, and their nerves were fraying by the second. "They're ready," Lucia murmured, her voice calm but resolute. She turned to Giovanni, who stood nearby with his phone in hand. "It's time to deliver the final blow." Hours later, Marco returned to Lucia's cottage with a USB drive in hand. The recordings were compiled and organized, clear footage of the bikers confessing to their shakedowns, threats, and intimidation tactics. The evidence was damning. Every word and action had been captured, painting an undeniable picture of the gang's crimes. Lucia carefully placed the USB drive into a small envelope, along with a handwritten note. She handed it to Giovanni. "Deliver this to Chief Marlowe. Make sure he understands what he's dealing with." Giovanni gave her a small nod, his respect for Lucia evident in his steady gaze. "Consider it done, Nana." The bikers were oblivious to the storm brewing against them. That evening, as they sat in the warehouse, tension hung heavy in the air. Sean was speaking, his voice low but firm, when the sound of sirens shattered the quiet. The gang froze, their heads snapping toward the windows as the glow of blue and red lights filled the room. "Cops!" Sean hissed, scrambling to grab the duffel bag he had stashed under the table. "Move! We've got to!" His words were cut off as the warehouse doors burst open, and Pinewood's police force stormed inside. Officers barked commands, their weapons drawn, as the bikers were quickly subdued. Sean struggled against the officers who pinned him to the wall, shouting curses and threats that fell on deaf ears. Fang and Jimmy were similarly restrained, while Martin sank to the floor, too shocked to resist. Chief Marlowe stepped into the room, holding the envelope Giovanni had delivered earlier. He glanced at Sean with a cold, disapproving glare. "You thought you could come into Pinewood and terrorize its people? Not on my watch." The gang was dragged out in handcuffs, their protests drowned out by the commotion. The townspeople, who had gathered outside at a safe distance, watched with a mix of relief and satisfaction. For weeks, the bikers had cast a shadow over Pinewood, but now, justice was finally being served. From her window, Lucia watched as the police cars disappeared down the road, carrying the bikers away. She didn't smile or celebrate. She simply turned back to her kitchen, her movements deliberate as she cleaned up her tea set. There was no joy in what she had done, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her town was safe once more. Later that afternoon, she stepped into her garden, her hands gloved and ready to tend to her roses. The sun shone brightly, bathing the garden in warm light. As she pruned a particularly stubborn stem, she paused for a moment, her thoughts drifting to the events of the past weeks. Lucia knew the peace wouldn't last forever. Trouble had a way of finding its way into even the smallest, quietest corners of the world. But she also knew that Pinewood was hers to protect, and as long as she was there, no threat would go unanswered. With a satisfied sigh, she returned to her work, her focus on the blooming roses that thrived under her care. Pinewood had been restored to its tranquil state, and for now, that was enough. The bikers sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts as they waited in their holding cells at Pinewood's police station. The realization of their capture stung worse than any physical wound. Sean stared blankly at the barred window, his mind replaying every misstep. How had it all unraveled so perfectly against them? The answer came unexpectedly, delivered through a cryptic remark from a visiting lawyer sent by their broader gang, the Iron Wolves. Vincent, a lieutenant of the Wolves, entered the precinct with the confidence of a man accustomed to control. His sharp suit and piercing eyes carried the weight of authority, instantly silencing the bikers' protests. "Do you idiots have any idea what you've done?" Vincent began, his voice low but deadly. He leaned against the bars of Sean's cell, glaring down at him. "You managed to pick a fight with someone who's been out of the game for years, and yet she still buried you alive. Do you even know who you crossed?" Sean's brows furrowed. "Who? The cops? Some local big shot?" Vincent chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Lucia Ricci. Ever heard the name?" The room grew tense as the name hung in the air. Jimmy, seated on the bench in the corner, looked up with wide eyes. "Ricci? Like the Mafia Ricci?" Vincent nodded, his smirk fading. The very same. La Madre Nera, the Black Mother. She used to run one of the most feared families in the region. Retired now, or so we thought. But clearly, she still knows how to play the game better than any of us. Sean clenched his fists. You're telling me this old lady brought us down? Not just brought you down, Vincent corrected. She made you irrelevant. And in doing so, she made the wolves look weak. Vincent wasted no time in addressing the consequences. Here's the deal, he said, his voice a razor's edge. The wolves have no interest in cleaning up after your mess. You've embarrassed us enough. But Lucia? She's given you more mercy than you deserve. She hasn't escalated this to us, and for that, you should be grateful. Sean's jaw tightened. What does she want? She's already got what she wanted, Vincent replied. Pinewood is her sanctuary, and she's made it clear that no one disturbs her peace. Your little operation is done, and as far as she's concerned, so are you. The wolves are pulling the plug on whatever dreams you had of expanding here. You're finished. The words landed heavily on the gang. Even Fong, who rarely showed emotion, looked visibly shaken. The iron wolves were cutting them loose, and Lucia Ricci had orchestrated their downfall without so much as raising her voice. Despite Vincent's warnings, whispers of discontent began to spread among the lower ranks of the wolves. Some saw Lucia's resurgence as a threat to their own power. A small faction, led by an ambitious underling named Eric, decided to test her boundaries. One night, Eric and a handful of loyalists drove into Pinewood, their bikes slicing through the quiet streets. They didn't come to negotiate. They came to send a message. But they underestimated Lucia, just as Sean and his crew had. As they approached her cottage, they found the lights on and the front door ajar. Cautiously, Eric dismounted his bike and stepped inside. The house was empty, but a single note lay on the dining table. It read, "You've made a mistake." Before Eric could react, the sound of engines roared in the distance. He rushed outside, only to find his men surrounded by sleek black sedans. From the cars emerged men in dark suits, their expressions cold and professional. Giovanni stepped forward, his presence commanding. "You weren't invited," Giovanni said simply, his voice steady. "But since you're here, let me remind you of something. Pinewood is not your territory. It belongs to Lucia Ricci." Eric sneered, reaching for his weapon, but before he could draw it, Giovanni's men had him and his crew disarmed and on their knees. From the shadows, Lucia appeared, her figure small but imposing. She walked slowly toward Eric, her eyes cold and unyielding. "You think you can challenge me?" she asked, her voice calm. "You think you can disrupt my peace and walk away?" Eric, now trembling, muttered an apology, but Lucia silenced him with a raised hand. "This is your only warning," she said. "Tell your people what happened here. Tell them Pinewood is mine. And if anyone forgets, I will remind them." She turned to Giovanni. "Let them leave. Make sure they don't return." As the gang was escorted out of Pinewood under armed watch, Lucia returned to her garden, her work unfinished. She snipped a rose and held it to her nose, breathing in its fragrance. The peace she had fought for was restored once more, but she knew it wouldn't be the last time someone tested her resolve. After all, legends had a way of attracting challenges. The aftermath of the Iron Wolves' retreat left Pinewood in a state of quiet celebration. The shadow cast by the bikers had dissipated, and the townsfolk slowly reclaimed their lives. Children played freely in the streets, shopkeepers reopened with a renewed sense of security, and neighbors exchanged stories of the mysterious events that had unfolded. While few knew the truth, the name Lucia Ricci carried an unspoken reverence among those who pieced together her role in the town's deliverance. For Granny Lucia, life returned to its usual rhythm, or so it seemed. She spent her mornings in her garden, trimming the roses and ensuring every bloom was perfect. Yet beneath the serene facade, she remained ever watchful. The events of the past weeks had reminded her that peace was fragile and that vigilance was the price of protecting what mattered. A visit from the wolves. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the town in warm hues, a sleek black car rolled up to Lucia's cottage. The vehicle's quiet hum disrupted the stillness, its polished exterior gleaming against the rustic charm of her ivy-covered home. Lucia, seated on her porch with a cup of tea in hand, watched the cars approach without a hint of surprise. She had been expecting this visit. Vincent stepped out, his movements deliberate but respectful. The lieutenant of the Iron Wolves, who had once carried an air of unshakable confidence, now approached with measured steps and a subdued demeanor. He removed his sunglasses, tucking them into his jacket as he reached the base of the porch. "Good evening, Mrs. Ricci," Vincent began, his voice low but steady. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Lucia gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit, Vincent. I don't bite." He obeyed, settling into the chair with a nod of gratitude. "I came on behalf of the Wolves," he said, pulling a sealed envelope from his jacket. "We wanted to express our respect, and our intention to leave Pinewood undisturbed." Lucia accepted the envelope but didn't open it. Instead, she set it on the table between them and folded her hands in her lap. "Respect is a rare currency, Vincent," she said. "And it's easily lost. Make sure your people remember that." Vincent inclined his head. "They will. You've made your point loud and clear." Lucia's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. Then we have nothing more to discuss." As Vincent rose to leave, he paused, glancing back at her. "Mrs. Ricci, if I may, why didn't you escalate? You had every reason to call us to heel, yet you chose restraint." Lucia met his gaze, her eyes sharp but kind. "Because true power isn't about destruction, Vincent. It's about knowing when not to use it. Now go, before your car disturbs my roses." Vincent chuckled softly, nodded in respect, and returned to his car. As he drove away, he couldn't help but marvel at the quiet strength of the woman who had orchestrated the wolves' retreat without breaking a single law. To him, she was more than a relic of a bygone era, she was a legend. Gratitude from the town. The townsfolk of Pinewood, though unaware of the full extent of Lucia's involvement, expressed their gratitude in subtle ways. Freshly baked loaves of bread, handwritten notes, and small gifts began appearing on her porch. While she never sought acknowledgement, these gestures warmed her heart. One afternoon, Clara and her son visited her with a basket of cookies. The boy, who had grown bolder since the biker's departure, looked up at Lucia with wide, curious eyes. "Mrs. Lucia," he asked, his voice earnest, "are you a hero?" Lucia knelt to his level, her gentle smile masking the weight of her past. "Heroes come in all shapes and sizes," she replied. "But the most important thing a hero can do is protect the people they love." Clara placed a hand on her son's shoulder, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." Lucia watched them leave, the basket of cookies in her hands. As she stepped inside, she placed the cookies on the kitchen counter and gazed out the window at her garden. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, their vibrant colors a testament to her care. In many ways, they reminded her of Pinewood itself, delicate, yet resilient under the right protection. A legacy remembered. That evening, as Pinewood settled into a peaceful slumber, Lucia sat by her window, her knitting abandoned on the table beside her. The streets were quiet, illuminated only by the soft glow of street lamps. She watched the stillness with a sense of satisfaction but knew the peace wouldn't last forever. Trouble, like the weeds in her garden, always found a way to return. She reached for her ledger, its leather cover worn with age. Flipping through the pages filled with names, numbers, and notes from a life she had left behind, she paused on a blank sheet. With a steady hand she wrote, "Pinewood is mine. Let no one forget." Closing the book, she leaned back in her chair and allowed the quiet to settle over her home. For now, she could rest, knowing she had done what was necessary to protect her town. But should the need arise, she would rise again, as formidable and unyielding as ever. The enduring vigil. In Pinewood, life went on. Children played, shopkeepers laughed, and the townspeople thrived under the protection of an unseen guardian. They might never know the extent of what Lucia had done for them, but that was exactly how she preferred it. The Black Mother's legend had been reignited, not as a specter of fear but as a symbol of quiet strength and relentless protection. And as the moon cast its gentle light over her cottage, Granny Lucia remained ever watchful, her resolve unbroken, her legacy secure.